I'm 52 now. I was in my mid-20s and I felt so old then. I'd got a 2-year-old and my 2-year-old is now in his late 20s. Yeah, it was crazy. I've got pictures of me doing it with him on my back in like a papoose with his little face, you know, hello, nice to meet you all. And I remember when we did the big thing at the town hall, Isaac was there and he used to be so good, but he knew when a show was over he could crawl on stage, but he'd never do it before, you know. And he crawled on stage and the guy that was the park manager at the time had got him a little dumper truck and presented him with this dumper truck. So this entire performance that the kids had done and I'd done and the musicians had done just went with everybody looking at this kid opening this truck going, oh, that's so cute. It's like, I don't know why we bothered really. But it was a lovely thought. So, does anyone remember this project that we did? I'll talk a little bit about it. I know you do, don't you?
I remember you doing the project.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was slightly too old to be involved with it.
So what it was, round about it would have been 1999 because the second one was 2000, yeah. There was a lot of arts funding sloshing around, unlike now. And Morpeth was redoing Carlisle Park. And what they decided is they wanted the community to engage with the park. And what better way than to put out a tender? And I put in a bid as a storyteller. I think there were lots of artists. And I put in this bid to create a story because it's something that I'd done all over the world in communities. And I really wanted to do it and continue to do. And much to my surprise, because I lived in Derbyshire, I got the job, which was great. But then there was all these logistics of how to deal with it with a small baby, which we managed, and everybody on board was incredible. And what it involved was working with the people in the park, because they'd found things, as they'd found a big rusty sort of medieval sword. They'd found all sorts of things, and working with the local schools to create stories. And what we ended up doing is creating what I would call an arc story, one big story. And within that, we put all the stories that the schools had created. And then I had a band at the time. I actually had a 7-piece klezmer band at the time. Klezmer is like Jewish music. And they came up and we did this 2-hour show with the music and the stories and the kids joining in, and it was just amazing. It was incredible. And we ran things through the park. So I'm going to tell you this story. Now, I won't be able to include all the stories that the kids put in, which were fantastic, but I am going to involve a few. And I might go, oh, it was the school up there. What's that school up there? You know, as you come into Morpeth, it's up on your right, and things like that, because it only exists in my head. Because I'm an oral storyteller, I come from a long line of Jewish. Yeah, well, the Dritzilla tradition it's a woman's tradition. It's passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, and women weren't taught to read and write because obviously their brains couldn't cope. That is irony, by the way. The number of times I have to explain that's a joke. But yes, there's a reference. Yeah. Yes. So they developed this amazing system of memory, of holding memory and story. So the story goes like this. There was a time, long ago, longer than you guys could imagine, longer than I could imagine, where there was a baron, one of the first barons of Morpeth. And he had heard that there was once a great king that used to hold a feast, and that always something magical should happen at that feast. Now, the baron himself had married, and they said that maybe his wife was of the Fae, but they weren't sure. But she had brought with her a beautiful black horse. And that horse, it said, could run faster than the wind. It could run faster than a the time it takes for a woman to change her mind. And that's fast, believe me, I know. And because of that, the Baron, he could send that horse with a rider to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west of all the borders of Northumberland. And his wife had this ability that the rider would bring back 4 bags of soil from each of those points. And just by smelling it, she would know if there were invaders on the borders. And so they would do this. But can you imagine, a horse like that had so much value. So people were always trying to steal it. And to stop them, what he went to a local blacksmith. And he asked the blacksmith to make 100 silver bells. And those bells were sewn into the mane and the tail of this horse. And it was known as the Black Steed of Bells. And he said that if anyone tried to steal this horse, because he was a fair man, but he did follow through with his word, if anyone tried to steal it, he would chop off their head. Very, very simple. And there were a few that had tried and failed and suffered the consequences. Now, I've got to get this right, is it the northwest? There is a little town called Hebron. And gosh, I've not told this for 20 years, bear with me. And in Hebron, there was a man that used to be a sheep thief. He was very, very good. They say that he started off small, a lamb here, a sheep there, then a cow. And he said that he was so skilled at what he did that he could steal your trousers off you. And the first that you'd know about it was a wind blowing around your nether regions. He was that good. But times had moved on and he'd fallen in love with a local lass, a farmer's daughter called Mary. But when the farmer found out that Mary loved the thief of Hebron, he said, "You two will never be wed." But the farmer was a bit of a gambler, and so was the thief. And they were gambling one day, and he turned to the farmer and he said, "I will do anything if you would allow me to marry Mary." And the farmer thought, this is the perfect opportunity to get rid of him. I will give him an impossible task that will result in his death. Job done. And so he said, well, if you can steal the Baron of Morpeth's Black Steed of Bells, you can have Mary's hand with my blessing. And before the words were finished on his tongue, the thief of Hebron said, "Consider it done." And the farmer smiled because he knew it was impossible. Mary wept. She said, "Do you know how hard this is?" And for the first time, that sort of arrogance left the thief. And he said, "Yeah, you're right. It's an impossible task, but one that I'm going to try because I might just succeed." And there was much weeping and wailing. And the thief, whose name was Tom, he said goodbye. And he didn't know whether he was ever going to see the love of his life ever again, but he was going to try. Now, it was the time of year when the Baron of Morpeth was having his feast. Because as I said, he'd heard all these old stories. He would have a feast, but the feast wouldn't start until something extraordinary happened. And he would wait. Sometimes that meal would go cold in the waiting. And that was the day that Tom, the thief of Hebron, decided to steal the Black Steed of Bells. He thought, everyone will be busy. There'll be music. There'll be feasting. There'll be chaos. Nobody will hear the bells. And I'm so good. I've got sleight of hand. I can do it. And so he snuck up to the manor house and he hid in the stables deep within the straw and he waited. Now, the Black Steed had a stablemate, the White Mare of Mar. And how the White Mare of Mar had come, well, she'd come with the Baron's wife. She'd brought the White Mare of Mar, and the White Mare of Mar has her own story, but it's more stories than I can tell you. But it said that the White Mare of Mar would usher in spring and summer. And when spring and summer were over, the White Mare would disappear and only come back when the spring was ready. But that mare it could run as fast as the steed of bells. You know, when you stable two horses together and one runs and the other will begin to match its pace, even though maybe it doesn't have the muscle or the stamina, because they're stablemates. That's what they do. The thief hid. And when he heard that the music was at its height, he stole out from that great pile of straw. And he very carefully reached up his hand and began to unhitch the rein that was holding the black steed. But the black steed shook its head and stomped its feet, and the bells began to ring. And the Baron said, "Stop the music." And they stopped the music, and he heard the bells, and he turned to his steward and he said, "Go down to the stables and see what you can see." And the steward went down to the stables, but the thief, leaving the rein over the hitch post, had hidden again, and the steward was eager to get back to the feasting. He just took one look, couldn't see anything, and went back, said, "There's nothing there, sir." "Very well, start the music again," said the Baron, and the music started, and the dancing started, and again the thief snuck out, and he took the rein off so carefully, and he put it over the head of the steed. And as he did, the steed shook its head and stamped its feet, and the bells rang, and it seemed to ring even louder, as if by some magical force. And again the Baron said, "Stop." And he looked at the steward and said, "Go and see what you can see." And the steward went a second time, but the thief had hidden behind one of the water troughs, and the steward didn't look properly and went back and reported that all was well. Well, the Baron wasn't having it. He didn't believe it. And what happened was, as the thief, as Tom, got the reins, jumped on the horse's back, he wasn't going to bother with the saddle, and started to run the horse, who should arrive but the Baron, who was suspicious. And he said, I know who you are, and I am going to hunt you down, and I am going to take your head." And he jumped onto the white mare of Mar. And the two horses were off, and they went over field and fen, over moss and moor, and over wood and wild place. They ran faster than the wind, and the white mare was trying to keep up, and she just couldn't. And soon she was foam flecked, and there was blood in her nostrils, and her eyes were wild, and the black steed of bells sensed this. So instead of just taking Tom off to safety, he stopped by the river. And they were both there. And Tom thought, oops, this wasn't quite what was supposed to happen. And so he could see the white mare of Mar, and he could see the Baron, and he was thinking fast, because that's how he'd survived all this time. And he said, "Sir," he said, "I've heard you're a gambling man. And you're a fine and fair man when there's a wager on the table. Would you wager with me?" And the Baron had enjoyed the ride, and he turned round, he said, "All right then, I'll listen to whatever you've got to say. If I tell you a tale that you would believe this night, would you give me the worth of it in my life?" And the Baron said, "Listen, I have been around a long time, and you're a thief. And there is not one tale you could tell me that I would ever believe. But it would make a fine night's entertainment. So off, tell me a tale." And this is the first tale that Tom, the thief, or the ex-thief of Hebron, told the Baron of Morpeth on that moon-filled night. And it goes like this. So if you can imagine the two horses, there's a sort of a truce. They're about 50 yards apart from each other. And Tom tells this story. He said, "It was an ancestor of mine, the son of Tom the Riddler. And it was a time when, the castle on the hill was just a wooden fort. And they were holed in there. And it was going to be a great feast day. And everyone had gathered, and the women were down at the river doing the washing, and there were pigs roasting, hogs roasting on the spits, and there was an air of there was going to be a great festivity, when one man on the top of one of the towers, looked over and saw what he saw on the horizon was water. And that wasn't possible. And then he looked a little closer and he saw it was moving. And what he realized was it was hundreds of spears and shields. And it was a Roman army. Yeah. And he sent the word out. And quicker than I can tell you, they gathered the women in, they closed the doors, they armed the battlements, and they waited it out. And the army looked, and you see, at that time, there were no oak trees around the bottom. And the general of that army looked and he thought, well, this is uphill. So they have the advantage. But I have the advantage that I have food, I have water, I have supplies, I can wait. And so the siege began. And as the siege began, well, it wasn't so bad because they'd been preparing for a feast. There was food. There was a well, there was water, but that can only last so long. And when the people began to get sick, and when the people began to die, that's when the king of that castle said, what should we do? And he called all the noblemen together to ask. And Tom, the Riddler's son, the descendant of Tom the thief, Tom was watching. And as he was watching, what he saw was a hawk in the sky. And the hawk had seen a mouse. And the mouse had seen the hawk. And the mouse, instead of running for freedom, hid underneath a hay wagon. And the hawk circled and circled and circled until it gave up. And when it gave up, quicker than I can tell you, that mouse sped out from under that hay wagon to the safety of its own hole. And Tom the Riddler's son saw this, and he got a plan. And when the king and all his noblemen were at their wits' end of what they should do, maybe they should finally show the white flag. Maybe they should give in for the sake of the people. They weren't warriors, they were just people. Tom knocked on the door, and the door opened, and there stood a young boy in front of all these rich, clever, noble men. And he said, Your Majesty, I have a plan. And they all laughed at him. They said, you're nothing but a mouse. And Tom smiled and said, but even a mouse can have a plan. And he told of the mouse he'd seen under the hay bale. And well, the king, he got no other ideas. He said, it will do you no harm, lad. We'll hear you out. And so he whispered his plan in the king's ear. And the king began to smile. Yes, he said, that is a great idea. You see, Tom the Riddler's son used to look after the pigs. And when the signal had sounded, he would always bring his pigs in with acorns, because pigs love acorns. So he would have pockets full of acorns. He had hundreds of acorns in his pockets, and he gave these all to the king. And the king gave everybody in that little wooden fort acorns. And then, under a white flag, he went down to speak to the general, and the general listened. And what the king said is, would you allow my people to plant one last harvest here? Because this is our land. And let us harvest that, and then we will leave in peace. And the general looked, and it wasn't a good advantage, and that was a fair offer and a noble offer, and he could respect that. How long would one last harvest take? 6 months? Well, he agreed. So you imagine his surprise when every single one of the villagers, and it took them from dawn till dusk, came down at the base of that hill and began to plant acorns. And as soon as they planted acorns, the general, he knew he'd been had, because oak trees take 350 years to grow. And to give their first harvest can be up to 100 years. They take 350 years to mature and another 300 to die. And he looked at the king and he said, "Well done, sir. Well done. I don't have it in me to continue the fight. You have outplayed me and outwitted me." And that's when the king said, "Actually, no, it wasn't me. It was Tom, the Riddler's son." And Tom, the Riddler's son, was brought forward. And you know what? From that day, he was never just looked down on as the pig boy. He was the boy that saved the people. And they say that sometimes, if you go there into the forest at the base of that hill, you might hear a rustling in the trees, or you might not. But they often say it's just that army of Roman soldiers coming back to see if the harvest has come in yet. But to date, it never has. Well, Tom, the thief of Hebron, finished the story, looked expectantly at the Baron, and the Baron was smiling, so he thought, "Well, this is good, this is good." And the Baron looked and he said, "It is a good tale. It is a fine tale, but I don't believe a word of it." And the chase was off again because the horses had got their breath back, and that chase went up the valley and down the valley, along the river, until the white mare of Mar was gasping for breath again. And they stopped at the far end of the river and again gasping for breath. And he said, "But if you, Baron, give me the worst of my tale, will you give me the sum of my life?" And the Baron said, "Well, there was a fine interlude last time. All right. I'll listen and I'll judge." And this is the second tale that he told, and it's the story of Red Rob the Reaver, and it goes like this. There was once a reaver called Red Rob. Red Rob had a blister, a spot on his nose, the size of a baby's fist, so red that in the middle of the night it looked luminous. He had red cheeks, probably from imbibing too much liquor, and he had bright red hair. And if that wasn't insult and injury, the worst colour, the colour that Rob hated most, was red. So when he was called Red Rob the Reaver, he really, he did everything to try and get rid of that title. But what would happen is he would come down with his raiding party every year. And the people, you might have seen some of the Reaver towers, they would bring cattle in the bottom of the tower and they would board themselves up in the top. But if you couldn't get your cattle in time, Red Rob would have them and take them away. And sometimes it was not a pleasant sight. He had taken so much of the livelihood of the people, and he was terrifying. His band were terrifying. And they would often invite themselves to weddings, and nobody could say no to them. And they would come and they would eat all the food and they would drink all the wine, and then they would weave their way drunkenly home, just scooping up whatever stray sheep or mount that they could. They were such a nuisance, but nobody knew what to do. Well, Tom, the Riddler's son, said to his father, "What should we do, Father?" And this is what happened. His father, whose name was John went to his wife and said, "You know that there's going to be a wedding next month, and you know that Red Rob and his men will come and they will get very, very drunk. What can we do?" And this is what I really admire. He sat down with his wife and asked her opinion, which I think you don't get enough of in stories. He sat down with his wife and he asked her opinion, and she said, "Let me go and speak to the women of the town, because they might have some ideas." And the women of the town got together and they came up with a plan. And the plan was this. Red Rob and his men came to the wedding as expected, and they got very, very drunk. as expected. And when they were weaving their way home, John and a few of the local men, they hid in the trees. And when most of them passed, when Red Rob was beneath them, they jumped on him, knocked him off of his horse and knocked him unconscious. And while he was unconscious, this is what the women of the town did. They had sewn a dress in a really fetching plaid that they put onto him. And they put 2 turnips down the front just for effect. And then they took his hair and they braided his long red beard into beautiful long braids with little red ribbons on the bottom. They combed his hair, they rouged his cheeks, they put a little lipstick on him. In fact, he looked quite delightful. They had handmade a shawl that they put round him as well, for modesty's sake, obviously. And then they put him back on his horse and they put a sign on his back that said, "I am a damsel in distress." They hit the buttocks of the horse and the horse went off. Well, when Red Rob came to, he didn't know where he was. It was like he'd had a very strange dream. But he was lost in the forest, and strange to tell, without his men, he wasn't quite so brave. Because bullies are like that sometimes, aren't they? And so what he did is he did what his father had taught him. He began to whistle a tune. And he whistled this tune loud and long, and in truth, the more he whistled it, the happier he was. He felt braver. And then what happened was this. As he whistled the tune, there came the sound of somebody in the undergrowth. And out of the undergrowth came a beggar man. Well, more of a poacher, really. But he had a kind heart, and he saw this rather hirsute woman. But, you know, it was a lonely life, and she looked like she was in some sort of distress. And he said, "Can I help you?" And Red Rob, his voice quivering a bit, said, I'm completely lost. And he said, "Well, I bet you're hungry." And I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you've had sometimes imbibed of the grape a little too much, you feel quite hungry in opportune moments. And he said, I do feel quite hungry, yes. And so what happened was he took him back to his house in the woods. And he made a bowl of stew and he put it in front of Red Rob, and then he passed over his prized possession, a big, shiny, silver spoon. And he said, "There you go." And Red Rob thanked him and began to eat and slurped, and the old beggar thought, "Oh, she's just like me. She's not ashamed of who she is. We could be happy together." Peering through the window was John the Riddler, watching all of this with his band of men. And as the soup was finished, the beggar very shyly pushed some bread across. It was all he got left. He said, "You might want to mop up the soup with that." And Red Rob grunted and said thank you and finished the bowl and then licked the spoon. And as he licked the spoon, he looked into it. And he screamed because he didn't recognise what was looking back at him. He said, "Who is that?" "Oh, bless you, my dear," he said, "you've obviously had a shock. That's you, and may I say how fetching you look. And I think what you've done with this is beautiful, beautiful. And the dress." Well, Red Rob couldn't believe it. He said, "Are you lying?" And the peddler went and got one of his other things. It was a tin pot that he had so much pride in that he kept polished. It was like a mirror, and he passed it over, and Red Rob looked and screamed and screamed and almost wept with frustration. He said, "What's happened? This isn't how I started the day." "Well," said the beggar, "these woods are a strange thing, and magic can sometimes happen." And then he reached over and very tentatively took Red Rob's hand. He said, "But we could be happy. And Red Rob suddenly realised what was going on. He snatched his hand away, and tears of frustration were falling down his cheeks. And then the beggar took his third prize possession. It was a lace handkerchief, and he handed it to Red Rob and said, "There you go. Dry your eyes, it'll all be fine in the morning." And Red Rob dried his eyes and, without thinking, put the handkerchief down the front of his dress, and then stood up so quickly and tried to get out so quickly that he opened the door without stepping back, knocked himself on his head, which was already sore from the night before, and again passed out on the floor. Well, when he came round, he looked up and he saw the beggar man and a few other faces that he didn't recognise. And he said, "Get me my horse." And the beggar man, he tried to get him to stay. He pleaded that he would love him like no other. But Red Rob was having none of it, and rather indelicately actually hitched the back of his dress up and shoved it in his belt so that he could get on his horse. But in doing so, he dropped the handkerchief. And in the handkerchief, there were lots of his own red hairs. Well, he made his way back to his band, but not before stopping and taking off the dress and watching as the turnips fell out and realising he hadn't gone through some magical transformation. He had been the butt of a horrendous joke. But he thought, I'll have my own back on those people. And so when the reaving season started again, he rode into town, but he didn't pick up any stray cattle or sheep on the way. He rode straight into town and confronted them, and he said, "I will burn this place to the ground if you don't give me your sheep, your cattle, and some of your fine young women to make wives for my men." And that was when John stepped forward and he said, "Red Rob, a truce, a truce." And he held up the lace handkerchief. And that's when Red Rob remembered all the faces that had been sitting round him when he'd passed out. There was John, the Riddler. There was his son, Tom. There were all of the local archers, the farmers, all of them. And they were all nodding very knowingly, and some were making quite suggestive gestures, actually. Some were just holding up turnips. And as soon as Red Rob saw that, he began to get even redder, and they turned round and they said, "If you leave now and never come back, no one will ever know of that night, and I give you my word. But if you come back, there are many here that witnessed the story and would be more than happy to tell it." Well, Red Rob didn't get to be the head of a band of reavers without knowing when to make a strategic retreat, which was exactly what he did. He left, he went north, and as far as we know, was never heard of or seen again. But every so often, they would do dances in the marketplace, and in homage to Red Rob, they would all hold up white handkerchiefs and twirl them around. The Baron of Morpeth listened. And the story was finished. And when it was finished, Tom, the thief of Hebron, said, "What do you think?" And the Baron was smiling from ear to ear. He said, "It's a good tale. It's a fine tale. But I don't believe a word of it. I told you, tell me one story that I can believe, and I'll give you your life. But if you can't, the deal is off." Well, what happened was this. They rode all night, and every so often they would have to stop by field or by fen, by river or by moor, by sometimes local hostelry, but they would stop and he would tell a story. Tom of Hebron would tell a story. And every time he told a story of a wicked dragoon that guarded a bridge. He told a story of two women that gave up all of their potions rather than be tried for witchcraft. But they also put belladonna on the pages, so everyone that would read it would maybe not make it through till the morning. He told story after story after story. He told 9 stories in all, more stories than I have the time to tell you. But for each one that he told, when he finished and he looked at the Baron, he said, "What do you think?" And the Baron said, "It's a good tale. It's a great tale. I'm having the time of my life. Best night ever. And, you know, it's a shame you won't have your head at the end of the night. Otherwise, I'd invite you back for the feast. But you know, I don't believe a word of it. I'm sorry. You know, I've got to be honest with you. I said I'd be honest. I'm known for my honesty. If I wasn't honest, what would people think? I don't believe it. I'm going to have to cut your head off." And the chase would go off again. And the chase finally finished right on the top of that very hill. You know, the hill that you can overlook all of Morpeth. You can see in many, many different directions, even more so back then. And as the Baron on the White Mare of Mar leapt the top of that hill, he saw that the thief, Tom of Hebron, had taken the black steed of bells and tied it to a tree and was just standing there as if accepting his fate. He said, I have no stories left to tell." "It's a shame," said the Baron. "I've got to like you over this night. We've had a fine ride, we've had fine tales, but I am a man of my word, and I said any man stole my horse, I'd take their head off." And he took out his sword. And the thief knelt down. And then he thought of Mary, and he said, "No tricks, sir, but could I tell you one last story? Not even really a story, something that happened to me. Because I wasn't always a thief. In my youth, I'd been a better man than you see now. I'd been a finer man, but life wasn't kind to me. And so I took to the thieving. But in my youth, I was a better man. Could I just tell you who I was, so that you could tell Mary, so she knows that I wasn't always the way I am?" And it seemed only fair. So the Baron sat on a rock with his sword on his lap, and he says, "Go ahead, my friend, go ahead." "In my youth," said Tom, "I was an adventurer. There wasn't much for me here. The family didn't have much land, and what land we'd got wasn't that good. I went further and further north. I bought passage on boats until finally I was at sea in a rough storm. I was the only one that survived in a little wooden boat. And fortunately I had some skill there, and I came to an island, the like of which I'd never seen before. And I had no idea where I was, but as I pulled the boat up onto the shore, there was a woman weeping, and she had in her arms a small baby. And she was looking down at the child, and every time she looked down at the child, she wept and wept and wept. And I went up to her and said, "Madam, what ails you?" And she said, "It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing I have to do, but I have to kill my own child." And he said, "Why? Why would you do that?" And she pointed up through the valleys where there was an outcrop of rock. And that outcrop of rock had the entrance to a cave. She said, "In there lives a ghoul, a monster. And every year we must sacrifice one child. And in return for that one child, he leaves us alone and doesn't bother us. In truth," she says, "it is my job to take the life of the child. It has not seemed such a hard thing. I am not proud, but I took some comfort that I was saving everybody else. But this year, my own child has been chosen, and I don't know how to do it. Give the child to me, said Tom. I'll do it. I have a sharp knife. And what he did was he took the child and he gave the child, you know those bright white rocks that you get? He gave the child the rock, and the child was so busy playing with that rock that did not see the knife, didn't see the flash of the blade, and the first thing that it was aware of was the pain, and it let out such a squeal, and the woman ran forward and picked up her child, and the thumb that Tom had cut off stayed there. He said, go back to the village and bake a pie and put the thumb in the pie. The wound will heal. The wound will heal, but your ogre will think, your ghoul will think that it is still your sacrifice, but put poison in that pie as well. And so they put hemlock and they put poppy seeds. They put all manner of things that you should never pluck or eat, even if you go up to the Anik poison garden. They packed it in. And right on the top, under the pastry, they put the child's thumb. Well, the pie was taken up to that cave, and the ghoul came out and ate and ate. It was the most delicious pie it had ever had in all the years, and then he was beginning to suspect maybe he'd been tricked. But then he found the thumb, and he thought, what human woman could cut the thumb off of a living child and hear it cry? That's just not possible. And so he continued to eat. Well, when the effects of the poison and the poppies worked through his body, he keeled over, and the men of the village and the women, with all their anger, well, they hurled him into the sea, and they say he's there still. Tom looked up at the Baron. That's it really, he said. I told you it wasn't much of a story, but it's the only decent thing I think I've ever done. It's a good tale, said the Baron. It's a fine tale. And with that, Tom pulled up his hair and waited. And the Baron sighed and walked forward and raised his sword, and as Tom tensed himself for the blow, he took in one deep breath, and then he heard it. It was a whoo, 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 whoo. And he looked up to see the sword turning over and over and over where it landed far below. He looked incredulously to the Baron, with the word why formed on his lips. And that's when the Baron began to take off his gloves. He said, of all the stories, that was the one that I would believe, because the thumb was missing on his right hand. I was that baby, he said. I was that child. Thank you for reminding me of where I came from. Take the black steed of bells and take it with my blessing. So he went back and he had the feast. He had the black steed, which he brought and stabled with the white mare of Mar. He went back to the farmer of Hebron and said, not only have I got the black steed of bells, but it was given to me by the Baron of Morpeth, the Lord of Morpeth, with his blessing. So the farmer had no choice. And so Tom and Mary were married, and as far as I know, lived happily ever after. And if you doubt the worth or the truth of my tale, you only have to look in the records and find that when they dug up Carlisle Park, what did they find? But a long, old, rusty sword that looked like it had been thrown there many, many years ago. Thank you very much for listening. And it was so much fun doing those stories with the children, because they'd come out with the suggestions and you go, really, that's quite dark? And they'd go, no, yes, yeah, we want the blood, we want the, yes, let's do it. And they were great to work with. They were fabulous to work with. And so we'd go in and we'd tell the kids a bit of the story and ask them for suggestions and what did they want to add and what did they like. And we worked with the high school students, we worked with the real, I think it was years 2, 3 and 4. I think we worked with year 3 and 4 mainly. And they were so creative. They were amazing what they came up with, you know. And then we did lots of projects where we put things out and asked people for their input. And then we contacted the local poetry groups and writers groups and said, right, they've put 100 steps in. Can you turn this story into 100 words? Which they did, you know, somebody did, and the 100 words are in the steps. But it's been 20 years and nobody can read them anymore. So I don't know what they are either. So we're going to go up later and try and work it out and send it in. And then we wanted to look at, you know, because Tom is an ex-thief, and you've got these rich people and these working class people. So we tried to put community groups together that would never normally meet. So we worked with the local mental health group, and they would do lots of cooking for the events that we did. We run treasure hunts through the park. We got the local, I think, Amdram Society, and the kids working together. We did so many things. It was a year-long residency, and it was a really beautiful time. And I learnt so much. As I say, I was at the beginning of my career then, and I learnt so much from that project that I now use all the time in everything I do. So there you go. Thank you very much.